Jake Torrance had lived in solitude for nearly a decade, a deliberate retreat from the noise of the world. He found peace in the rhythm of restoring antique machinery in his old barn and watching the stars from his small cabin nestled in the Montana woods. His only companions were a scruffy dog named Rusty and the endless, unbroken silence of the countryside. That night, Jake was tinkering with a rusty engine in his garage when a sudden rumble shook the ground beneath him. He ran outside, his wrench still in hand, and looked up just in time to see a streak of light carving through the night sky, trailing smoke and fire. It wasn't an ordinary shooting star. This was something larger, something falling fast. The object plummeted into the woods a mile away, and the earth shuddered with the impact. The light from the crash illuminated the forest briefly, casting long shadows and igniting a plume of smoke that billowed into the starry sky. Rusty barked furiously, his hackles raised. What in the hell was that? Jake muttered to himself. He grabbed his flashlight and slung a toolbox over his shoulder. Against his better judgment, he headed toward the crash. The woods were dense, and the smell of burning wood and scorched earth grew stronger as Jake pushed through the underbrush. He reached the edge of a clearing and froze. There, embedded in the ground, was the source of the commotion, a craft unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It wasn't made of metal, at least not entirely. The surface of the craft pulsed faintly with a bioluminescent glow, as if it were alive. It resembled a giant seed pod more than a machine, with smooth, organic curves and strange veins running along its surface. One side of the craft was torn open, exposing an interior that glimmered with soft, iridescent light. Jake's breath caught in his throat as movement near the wreckage caught his eye. A figure stumbled out of the craft, a woman, but not any woman Jake had ever seen. Her skin shimmered like liquid silver under the moonlight, her hair flowed like strands of woven light, and her large, luminous eyes seemed to glow faintly. She clutched a small bundle to her chest. The woman staggered a few steps before collapsing onto her knees. Jake rushed forward, instinctively holding out his hands. "Hey! Are you okay? Can you hear me?" His voice trembled with uncertainty. The woman looked up at him, her expression a mix of desperation and exhaustion. "Help! Us," she murmured in heavily accented English, her voice barely audible. Then she collapsed entirely, the bundle in her arms rolling to the ground. Jake crouched down and carefully picked up the bundle, unwrapping it to reveal a child. The little one's skin was the same silvery hue, but their eyes were wide open and filled with fear. Jake felt a pang of something paternal instinct, perhaps, as the child whimpered softly. Okay, Jake said, his voice softer now. "I've got you. Let's get you out of here." He lifted the woman and the child with surprising ease. Though they looked humanoid, they were lighter than they appeared, almost weightless in his arms. He carried them back through the woods, Rusty trotting nervously behind him, occasionally growling at the unfamiliar scent lingering in the air. Back at his cabin, Jake laid the woman on the old couch and placed the child next to her. He rummaged through his first aid kit, unsure if anything he had would work on alien biology, but he cleaned the cuts and bruises he could see. The woman's breathing was shallow but steady, and the child clung to her side, watching Jake warily. "You're safe now," Jake said, though he wasn't sure how true that was. He looked at the woman again, her strange yet striking features framed by the faint glow of her skin. Who were they? Where had they come from? And, more importantly, what had brought them crashing to Earth? As Jake pondered these questions, he didn't notice the faint beeping coming from a device on the woman's wrist. Far above Earth, in the cold reaches of space, a fleet of dark, predatory ships caught the signal. The hunt was on. When the woman finally stirred, her silvery eyes fluttered open, and her gaze darted around Jake's small cabin. Jake was sitting in a chair across from her, his arms crossed and his expression cautious but not hostile. Rusty, his dog, sat at his feet, growling softly as he eyed the alien woman. "Hey there," Jake said gently, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe now. Can you understand me? The woman nodded weakly, her body still trembling as she tried to sit up. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though even the act of breathing drained her energy. The child by her side clung to her arm, their large, glowing eyes staring at Jake. Thank you, the woman said, her voice soft but carrying a melodic quality that made the words linger in the air. My name is Lyra. This is Ori. She placed a protective arm around the child, who buried their face against her shoulder. Jake leaned forward, his curiosity outweighing his lingering apprehension. You're not from around here, are you? Lyra gave a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. No. My home is far away. Another world. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. We were fleeing. Fleeing? From what? Jake asked, his brows furrowing. Lyra hesitated, glancing at Ori before answering. A powerful syndicate. They control much of my region of space. My planet, Velder 9, resisted them, but we were no match for their strength. They destroyed our cities, captured our leaders, enslaved our people. Jake felt a pang of sympathy. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to lose an entire planet. And you escaped? Lyra nodded, though the movement was slight. I was a scientist. I worked on our planetary defense systems, but they failed. My family. Everyone I knew. Her voice broke, and she took a steadying breath. Ori and I were among the last to leave. I had a ship, but they pursued us. Damaged us. We barely made it here. Jake let the information sink in, his mind reeling. So, you're telling me they're still looking for you? They could come here? Lyra met his gaze, her silvery eyes filled with guilt. Yes. I am sorry. I did not mean to bring danger to your world. But I had no choice. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at Rusty, who seemed just as bewildered as he was. Well, you're here now. We'll figure it out. Lyra looked at him, her expression softening. Why would you help us? You do not even know us. Jake shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Call it old-fashioned human hospitality. Besides, you needed help. What kind of person would I be if I turned my back? Her lips curved into a faint smile, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. You are kind, Jake. He waved it off, feeling a bit embarrassed. Yeah, well, let's see how kind I am when I'm trying to fix your ship. That thing's like nothing I've ever seen. Lyra's expression grew serious again. It is not just a ship. It is alive, in a way. It was grown, not built, to bond with its pilot. It is badly damaged, but if we can repair its core systems, it can heal itself. Jake raised an eyebrow. Alive? That's gonna be a steep learning curve. But I'll give it a shot. It's not like I haven't pulled miracles out of scrap metal before. Lyra nodded, her gratitude evident. I will guide you. The ship's systems are complex, but together, we may succeed. As Jake began planning how to approach the repairs, Ori suddenly tugged at his sleeve. The child had been silent until now, but their soft, melodic voice startled him. Will the bad people come? Ori asked, their wide, glowing eyes brimming with fear. Jake crouched down to their level, his tone gentle but firm. Not if I can help it, kid. You and your mom are safe here. Ori studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod before retreating to Lyra's side. Jake stood, a new resolve hardening in his chest. He didn't know how he was going to pull it off, but he wasn't about to let anything happen to Lyra and Ori not while they were under his roof. Over the next few days, Jake worked tirelessly with Lyra to assess the damage to her ship. The craft's organic systems were unlike anything he'd ever encountered. It responded to touch, sometimes shifting under his hands as if alive. Lyra explained how the ship's core was powered by a fusion of biological and quantum energies, far beyond Earth's technology. Jake quickly realized he wasn't just repairing a machine, he was working with it, coaxing it back to life. Lyra's knowledge of her ship was invaluable, though her weakened state forced her to rest often. Ori, meanwhile, grew curious about the world outside Jake's cabin, marveling at the trees, animals, and stars. Despite the challenges, the small group began to feel like a makeshift family. Jake found himself growing attached to Lyra and Ori, even as he worried about the danger they brought with them. Late one night, as Jake worked on the ship under a tarp to shield its glow from prying eyes, Lyra sat beside him, watching quietly. "Thank you," she said after a long silence. Jake glanced at her. "For what?" "For risking so much for us," she replied. "You could have walked away." "Many would have." Jake smirked. "Yeah, well, walking away's never really been my thing." Lyra smiled, a hint of warmth breaking through her weariness. But her smile faded as the faint beeping on her wristband started again, a signal Jake had learned to recognize. "What is it?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew. Lyra's expression darkened. "They found us." The quiet moment was shattered. The hunters were closing in. The tranquil woods around Jake's cabin turned into a battlefield within minutes. Lyra's wristband had barely stopped beeping when the first signs of the hunters appeared. A low, ominous hum reverberated through the air, followed by beams of light scanning the forest from above. Jake grabbed a rifle from his stash of hunting gear, though he doubted it would do much against alien technology. Rusty growled and barked at the approaching lights, his tail rigid. Lyra, clutching Ori tightly, moved to the center of the cabin. "They're coming faster than I expected," Lyra said, her voice tense but composed. "We have to move." Jake peered out the window and saw the first of the hunter ships, a sleek, black craft hovering just above the treetops. Its underside glowed faintly, illuminating the ground below as if searching for something. "Move where?" he asked. "They've got air support, and we're sitting ducks out here." Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes scanning the cabin as if searching for an answer. Then she pointed toward the ship hidden under the tarp. "The vessel isn't ready for long-distance travel, but it can hover. If we can get to the woods, we might lose them." Jake nodded, grabbing a backpack filled with tools and supplies he'd prepared for emergencies. He handed it to Lyra. "Take this. I'll cover you." "You can't fight them alone," Lyra protested. Jake gave her a faint smile. "I'm not planning to win. Just slow them down. Now go." A deadly game of hide-and-seek. Lyra and Ori sprinted toward the ship as Jake stepped outside, rifle in hand. He fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to draw the hunters' attention. The tactic worked. The nearest ship turned its beam toward him, and a mechanical voice echoed from its speakers. "Surrender the fugitives. Noncompliance will result in termination." Jake raised his hands in mock surrender, then fired another shot, this time directly at the glowing underside of the craft. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly, but the act of defiance seemed to irritate the hunters. A streak of energy shot out, striking the ground just feet from Jake and sending him tumbling backward. "Guess they don't negotiate," Jake muttered, scrambling to his feet. He ducked behind a tree and fired again, this time aiming at one of the craft's visible sensors. It sparked briefly, forcing the ship to adjust its position. Meanwhile, Lyra and Ori reached the ship. Lyra placed Ori inside and quickly began interfacing with the controls. Her fingers moved over the organic dashboard, coaxing the craft to respond. The ship groaned and shuddered as its systems powered up, its bioluminescent surface pulsing with faint energy. "Hold on, my little star," Lyra whispered to Ori. "We'll be safe soon." Back in the clearing, Jake's resistance was wearing thin. A second hunter craft appeared, its lights sweeping the forest floor. The first ship had recalibrated its damaged sensor and was now zeroing in on him. Jake ducked behind a boulder, breathing heavily. "Any time now, Lyra," he shouted, hoping she could hear him. The ship suddenly roared to life, its thrusters igniting with a brilliant blue glow. It hovered a few feet off the ground, shaking loose the tarp Jake had used to conceal it. Lyra emerged briefly, waving toward Jake. "Get in," she yelled. Jake sprinted toward the ship, dodging another energy blast that sent dirt and debris flying. He leapt inside just as Lyra activated the ship's outer shielding. The hunters fired another volley, but this time the beams dissipated harmlessly against the ship's pulsating surface. Into the woods. The alien vessel rose higher, weaving through the dense forest with surprising agility. Lyra was at the controls, her face focused and determined. Jake sat beside her, gripping the edges of his seat as the ship narrowly avoided colliding with tree trunks and branches. "Is this thing supposed to handle like a roller coaster?" Jake asked, his knuckles white. "It's not fully functional yet," Lyra admitted, her voice strained. "But it's better than staying still." Ori, strapped securely into a seat behind them, watched the scene with wide eyes. Despite the danger, the child remained remarkably calm, as if trusting completely in Lyra's ability to protect them. The hunters pursued, their sleek crafts gliding through the forest with predatory precision. Jake glanced at the rear monitor and cursed under his breath. "They're not giving up." "They won't," Lyra said grimly. "Not until they have us." Jake's mind raced. He wasn't an expert in alien warfare, but he knew how to think on his feet. "Can we lose them in the old missile silo?" "It's a few miles west of here. The place has underground tunnels. They might not be able to follow." Lyra considered his suggestion. "If we can buy enough time to power up the ship's cloaking system, it could work." "Great. Head west," Jake said. "I'll handle the rest." Lyra nodded, adjusting the ship's trajectory. The hunters intensified their assault, firing relentless energy blasts that clipped the ship's shielding. Lyra expertly dodged the attacks, but the strain was evident on her face. The ship wasn't designed for this kind of combat, and it was taking its toll. Jake rummaged through the backpack he'd brought, pulling out a handful of small devices he'd cobbled together from his garage. They were crude but functional makeshift EMPs designed to disrupt electronics within a small radius. "You're full of surprises," Lyra said, glancing at the devices. "Let's hope these surprises work," Jake replied. He opened a hatch near the rear of the ship and tossed the EMPs into the air. They detonated mid-flight, releasing bursts of electromagnetic energy that caused one of the hunter ships to spiral out of control and crash into the forest. "Two down, one to go." Jake cheered, slamming the hatch shut. The silo. The missile silo loomed ahead, its entrance hidden by overgrown vegetation. Lyra brought the ship down with practiced precision, landing it just outside the entrance. Jake and Lyra quickly guided Ori into the tunnels while the remaining hunter ship circled above, searching for its quarry. Inside the dark, damp tunnels, Jake led the way with a flashlight. The air was stale, but the thick concrete walls provided a much-needed sense of security. Lyra carried a small console from the ship, working furiously to activate the cloaking system. "They'll find us if we don't act fast," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Jake nodded, his jaw set. "Then let's make sure they don't." As the hunters closed in, Jake, Lyra, and Ori prepared for one final stand. The missile silo echoed with the hum of alien technology as Lyra frantically worked to activate her ship's cloaking system. The thick concrete walls provided temporary cover, but the sound of distant footsteps and mechanical whirring above reminded Jake that their enemies were closing in. "We're running out of time." Jake called over his shoulder, scanning the silo's dark corridors with his flashlight. Rusty barked nervously, his tail tucked between his legs. Lyra's fingers moved rapidly over the console she had brought from the ship. Strange symbols and holographic interfaces glowed in the dim light. I need a few more minutes to bring the cloaking system online. It's delicate work, one wrong move, and the ship could destabilize. Delicate, huh? Jake muttered, glancing toward the hatch at the far end of the silo. Well, delicate's not exactly my specialty, but keeping those guys off our backs is. Stay here. Before Lyra could object, Jake slung his rifle over his shoulder and sprinted back toward the entrance. Rusty followed at his heels. The final stand outside the silo, the remaining hunter ship descended, its searchlights sweeping the area. From the craft, several armored figures emerged, tall, humanoid beings clad in black, insect-like exoskeletons. Their movements were unnervingly fluid, and their glowing red visors scanned the terrain with chilling efficiency. Jake crouched behind a crumbling concrete barrier, his heart pounding. All right, fellas, he whispered to himself, time to see how much trouble an old Earthling can cause. He lobbed another of his makeshift EMPs toward the advancing hunters. It detonated with a sharp crackle, sending a burst of electromagnetic interference through the air. One of the hunters collapsed, its armor sparking and twitching. The rest of the group turned toward Jake's position, weapons glowing ominously. Energy blasts seared through the air, striking the ground around him. Jake ducked and returned fire, his rifle useless against their armor but effective at drawing their attention. Over here, you ugly bastards! Jake shouted, retreating further into the silo's maze-like surroundings. His goal wasn't to win, it was to keep them busy long enough for Lyra to finish her work. Ori's power awakens back in the silo's core chamber. Lyra worked with grim determination. The ship hummed faintly as its systems began to stabilize. She glanced at Ori, who sat nearby, their small hands glowing faintly with a silver light. Ori, sweetheart, Lyra said softly, kneeling beside the child. I need your help. The ship's core is still weak. I can't do this without you. Ori hesitated, fear flickering in their wide eyes. But what if I'm not strong enough? You are, Lyra said, her voice firm but gentle. You carry the spark of our people. You were born for this. Trust yourself. With a shaky nod, Ori placed their hands on the console. The glow in their palms intensified, and the ship's bioluminescent surface brightened. The room was bathed in ethereal light as the core systems roared to life. It's working, Lyra whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. It's working. A narrow escape. Jake's luck was running out. The hunters were closing in, their weapons carving through his makeshift defenses. He ducked behind a steel beam, breathing heavily, as one of the figures loomed over him. Just as the hunter raised its weapon to strike, a deafening roar shook the ground. The silo's entrance collapsed in a shower of debris, cutting off the remaining hunters. Jake shielded his eyes and looked up to see Lyra's ship hovering above him, its pulsating surface radiating with power. Jake, get in. Lyra's voice called through the ship's comms. Wasting no time, Jake sprinted toward the ship as its hatch opened. He leapt inside just as the craft began to ascend, Rusty barking excitedly at his side. Above them, the remaining hunter ship unleashed a barrage of energy blasts, but Lyra's ship darted through the air with newfound agility. Inside, Lyra guided the vessel with precision, her hands moving over the organic controls as if they were an extension of herself. Cloaking system activated, she announced. The ship shimmered, then vanished from sight. The hunter ship hesitated, its scanners searching in vain for its target. After a tense moment, it retreated, leaving the night sky empty once more. A promise fulfilled. The ship soared higher, breaking through Earth's atmosphere and into the quiet expanse of space. Jake stared out the viewport, his breath catching as he saw Earth shrink behind them. It was a sight he had never imagined he'd see, a view reserved for astronauts and dreamers, yet here he was. You did it, Jake said, turning to Lyra. No, Lyra replied, her expression soft. We did it. Ori approached Jake, their glowing eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, the child said softly. For helping us. Jake knelt down, ruffling Ori's hair. "You're welcome, kid. Just keep being brave, all right?" The ship's controls emitted a soft chime, and Lyra turned toward Jake. "I've set a course for a safe Zone A hidden colony where my people are regrouping. Ori will be protected there." Jake nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. "That's good. They need you. Both of you." "You could come with us," Lyra offered, her glowing eyes searching his face. "There's a place for you among my people. You've proven yourself more than worthy." Jake hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked out the viewport again, the vastness of space stretching before him. "I appreciate that," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But Earth is my home. Someone's got to keep an eye on it, just in case." Lyra smiled faintly, her respect for Jake evident. "Then this isn't goodbye. If you ever need us, look to the stars." As the ship approached the coordinates of the safe zone, Jake felt a sense of closure. He had helped Lyra and Ori find safety, but more than that, he had found a purpose greater than himself. Epilogue. Back on Earth, Jake returned to his quiet life in Montana, but things were different now. He spent his nights gazing at the stars, searching for the faint shimmer of Lyra's ship among the constellations. Months later, a strange plant began to grow in the clearing where Lyra's ship had first crashed. Its leaves shimmered with a silvery glow, and its blossoms emitted a soft, melodic hum. Jake tended to it carefully, knowing it was a gift from his friends, a reminder that even across the vastness of space, they were connected. And somewhere among the stars, Lyra and Ori began rebuilding their lives, carrying with them the memory of the Earthling who had saved them.